G'day guys, how you doing? It's the Kiwi and I'm back with another video. In this video we're going to be talking about the Ukraine. Before I get going with this video, first and foremost I want everybody to know that I do not agree with what is happening in the Ukraine in any way, shape or form. I think that any form of conflict where there's death of innocent civilians, women, children is appalling. So I do not agree with what is happening in that region. The purpose of this video is to just bring to light certain aspects of what has been happening in that country that is not being reported in the mainstream media or even alternative media on YouTube. I've been absolutely appalled, genuinely appalled by the lack of honesty and journalistic integrity that has been displayed on pretty much all media platforms. There's only a handful of individuals out there that are actually doing an outstanding job of getting the truth that is happening in that region out. So with that being said, the reason why I want to talk about this subject, or we're talking about this subject, is in 2009 and 10 I spent a reasonable amount of time in the Ukraine. It's a country that's very dear to my heart. Outside of the United States, New Zealand, Ukraine is a country that's very dear to my heart. The people in that country are lovely people, amazing people. I have had nothing but excellent experiences while traveling that part of the world. The reason why the Ukraine came to my attention was in 2009 I met a lady by the name of Svetlana Oxenyenko, more appropriately known as Dr. Svetlana Oxenyenko. Oh, by the way, just in case you think I'm full of doo-doo, here is my old cancelled New Zealand passport. There is me. That's what I looked like a couple of years ago, like 12 years ago. There's one of my visas for the Ukraine, Austria, Germany, and here is another one of my visas for the Ukraine. So sincerely, I have actually traveled that region. And there were times over the last 12 years I have thought about going back again. It's also been a country I'd thought about possibly retiring to. But anyway, all that aside, I met this lady in Santa Barbara, Dr. Svetlana Oxenyenko, and sincerely I did meet her in Santa Barbara, California. That's where she was living at the time. She was over here in the US on a student visa. She was studying at the Santa Barbara College, and she was just trying to get into the United States via marriage at the end of the day, which was something I wasn't interested in, to be honest. But Dr. Svetlana Oxenyenko, she used to work at what would be known as the Chemical and Biological Warfare Laboratories in Kharkiv in the Ukraine, in the original, the OG Chemical and Biological Warfare Labs in Kharkiv in the Ukraine. Barack Obama will actually know who Dr. Svetlana Oxenyenko is, because he actually spent a pretty decent amount of time with her in 2006, actually going over all the bioweapons storage, how this stuff is kept under lock, all this sort of stuff. But the interesting thing is that even though these labs were known of, they were still doing nefarious work. They were doing work in regards to modifying of viruses, insects, and even animals, rodents, that could be potentially utilized as some form of bioweapon. And the good doctor actually really schooled me on this stuff. She explained to me where these labs were. There were other labs in Africa, and it's very interesting because just in the last couple of years there's been certain African leaders who were not willing to take part in any vaccine trials, testing, or anything like that, that miraculously kind of just died and were replaced with leaders that were pro rolling out these vaccines. So right now there is somewhere in the vicinity of maybe a dozen of these labs throughout the Ukraine. And the interesting thing about this is, in the media, they're telling you that, you know, the Ukraine wanted to become a member of NATO, the Ukraine wants to be a NATO nation, all this sort of stuff. Well, the reality of the situation is a country can't be a part of NATO if it's got any of these biochemical warfare labs. They're highly illegal. Highly, highly, highly illegal to have in a NATO member country. Even the UN, under the UN, the Geneva Convention, everything, they're just unbelievably illegal. And this all came about at the end of the Cold War, as did the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. But the reality of the situation is this couldn't have been more apparent in regards to how illegal these things are with Anthony Fauci and his gain-of-function research. He wasn't able to do this in the United States, so they did it in Wuhan. It's been proven. You only have to Google it to find the actual proof. It's been 100% proven that this is what Fauci and the NIH were doing. And they're doing it in China. And guess what China is? It's another non-NATO country. Right now in New Zealand, as I speak, there's been another bio lab opened up in Timaru, New Zealand, with great fanfare. But what are they going to be experimenting or testing down in New Zealand now, in this obscure part of the world? You know, it's like you can't trust any of these countries that are non-NATO members to have any of these bio labs. You'll find Bill Gates continually talking about how they're getting research and studies and all this sort of stuff coming out of Africa in regards to viruses and vaccines and how the vaccines work with the viruses and all this sort of stuff. It's illegal. Straight up, you can't be testing on whole populations of the world, even though I have a funny feeling that what's happened in the last couple of years has been one massive global test. An Australian politician actually admitted this on TV just this last week. So after 2008, though, this was when all these problems started, because what happened was the Ukraine actually went bankrupt. The Ukrainian government is incredibly corrupt. And when I mean incredibly corrupt, the Ukrainian government is seriously an incredibly corrupt government. The World Banks had loaned the Ukrainian government billions upon billions of dollars, and that money only made its way down through the first top 3 levels of the Ukrainian government. The money never made it out into programs helping the population, nothing. No business development, no anything. And this is the other thing that makes absolutely no sense about the Ukraine trying to become a member of the EU. That's another whole can of worms. It's not as clean cut as what people think it is. So what happened was there was a pro-Russian government was elected in the Ukraine after 2008. I can't remember what year it was. Maybe 2010, I can't honestly remember. And what happened was the Russian government was willing to make good on the Ukrainian government's debt. And it was very ironic that right at the time that the Ukraine had a pro-Russian government elected, and then the Russians were willing to pay off the Ukrainian government's debt, that about a year to 18 months later, there was a whole bunch of protests start in Kiev, the capital. Well, what a lot of people don't realize, and I can't tell you how I know this, however it is legit, in November of 2011, there was a group of operatives were actually punched out of a US naval submarine off the coast of Odessa in the Ukraine that met up with other operatives actually in Ukraine to train up specific individuals, pro-Nazis you could call them. These guys are more from the western part of the Ukraine, because the western part of the Ukraine, a lot of people in that region actually joined forces with the Nazis during the Second World War. So there's still a very pro-Nazi population in the western part of the Ukraine. So these operatives ended up working with these militias, you could basically call them, in the western part of the country, and getting them trained up to actually start causing trouble in Kiev, actually start these protests, which became known as the Maidan protests. Well, these protests fermented to the point where the pro-Russian government was actually overthrown. The parliament buildings were stormed, and that Prime Minister of Ukraine, Poroshenko, I think it might have been, I can't remember exactly, he fled to Russia. Then what ensued was a pro-Western government was put in place, and those individuals that were trained to overthrow the government ended up, many of them ended up in the Donbass region and started working with militias, some members of the Ukrainian military, etc., in that part of the world. The issue that is with that region of the world is it's very, very close to the Crimean. It's like right there. And at certain points, Russia would most probably utilize the Donbass region of the Ukraine to transition or move through Ukrainian territory to actually get to the Crimean. So what happened was Putin's got a huge amount of assets in the Crimean, as everybody knows. However, what happened in the Crimean, what you've been told in the West and what is actually the truth, are actually two totally different things. You see, the Crimean was given, not necessarily given, it was handed over to the Ukraine in 1954 under Nikita Khrushchev. And what happened was it was always Russian territory, but it flew the Ukrainian flag. The Crimean was always had its own government. It had its own independent government that worked with the Ukrainian government. And what happened was when this pro-Western government was put in power in the Ukraine in around 2012, 13, somewhere around there. And excuse me, I might have those dates off. I apologize if I do. What happened was Putin did everything 100% legally. And what happened was he asked the Crimean government if they wanted to still be under Ukrainian rule or if they wanted to be under Russian rule. Now, the Crimean primarily is majority ethnic Russians, as is the majority of the Donbass region. And what happened was they held a referendum, completely legal, and it was like 90-something% of the population voted to be with Russia. So then what had to be done is all the flags, all the Ukrainian flags on government buildings were to be lowered and Russian flags to be raised. And once Russian flags were raised, then the Russian government had the authority to move into the Crimean and take back control of the Crimean. And that's literally what happened, to the letter. Everything that Putin did in taking over the Crimean again was done at the will of the people. And you can search this on YouTube. There's so many videos. Putin Putin literally was walking down the main streets of Sevastopol, I think it was, if I remember correctly. No guards. And people were just hugging him, kissing him, loving him. Straight up. Straight up. How many leaders of a country like that, like Russia or the United States, could you see Joe Biden walking down the middle of some street by himself right now, having the population running up to him and hugging him and kissing him and holding his hand and kissing his hand and all that sort of stuff? Could you see that happening in the United States right now? I don't think so. Google it. Go to YouTube and look up Putin walking down the streets, Crimean, and how much loved he was. The reality of the situation is this. Everything that you're being told in the Western media about what's happening in the Ukraine right now is pretty much a lie. And I don't really know what else to tell you. It's absolutely appalling, from mainstream media to alternative media. The lack of knowledge that people have on this region is unbelievable, and it's the reason why the United States and its foreign policies, it's the reason why the US gets in so much trouble around the world. They don't take time to learn about the regions they're going into. And then you've got this incredibly biased media that just refuses to report the truth. I mean, it is just absolutely horrific. I just do not understand why this has to be happening in the Ukraine when NATO, the United Nations, and NATO allies such as the United States, Great Britain, they've all had the opportunity to actually make this correct, and they haven't. They've used the Ukraine as a tool for their own nefarious gains. You can research it. The actual United States Department of Defense has been funding these biolabs throughout the Ukraine, and they're highly illegal. But yet NATO hasn't done a thing about it, because everybody's getting paid off left, right, and center. So if you've got any questions, any comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And also, I'm going to leave a link in the description section for a gentleman who's an investigative reporter. His name is George Webb. And if you really want to know exactly what's going on in that region of the world, I would highly, highly, highly recommend listening to George Webb. But outside of that, that's my video, guys. And yeah, like I said, if you've got any questions, you feel free to leave them in the comments section. Alrighty, I'll talk to you fellas later. Cheers.